Hello everyone. Today we start to talk about advanced fluid mechanics. Our first notion is called tensor. So what is a tensor? Actually, this is our way to refer to a fluid property. So any fluid property, we can treat it as a tensor. The background is in, of course, our space, n-dimensional Euclidean space. In fluid mechanics, usually the n is equal to 2 or 3, right? If it's just 2, then it will be a simple planar problem. Okay, so in order to refer to a tensor, we need to point out which order of tensor that property is. The simplest tensor will be a 0th order tensor. What does the term order mean? Very simple. It's just how many components our property has. Let's say a 0th order tensor only has n to the power of 0, which is equal to 1, right? One component in the n-dimensional space. So can you think of what this kind of property is? A property in our space that only has one component. This is something we are all very familiar with, which is called scalar, actually, right? Say the density rho in the space, in every point of the space, we only have one component of rho, right? And also time and any scalar, you name it. One step ahead is called the first order tensor, which has n to the power of 1 components. So what are these kind of tensors? This is another thing we are all very familiar with, which is called vector. Vector, right? Say the velocity in a n-dimensional space at one point has how many components? 3, right? Ux, uy, uz, the velocity component at the x, y, and z directions respectively. Or sometimes we call that uvw. Or in our course, usually we refer to them as u1, u2, u3. In our course, we do not, we prefer to call the three axes, x, y, z axis, to be sometimes x1, x2, x3 axis. So we refer to the velocity components on those three directions to be u1, u2, u3, but let's get on to that later. Okay, so these two we are familiar with, but the next thing I think we may not be familiar with up to now. So obviously the second order tensor will have n to the power of 2 n squared components, right? So this thing, do you know what this thing is called? Very simple, second order tensor. Well, to denote a second order tensor, usually we write a letter and add 2 bars on it. While in a vector, we usually write 1 bar on it or an arrow on it. Okay, so my habit is to refer to a vector by denoting an arrow on the letter. But in the second order tensor, I prefer to write 2 bars on it. Sometimes in some books, you can maybe also see a letter with this kind of arrow on it. But I'll stick to the notation of this and this. This is just the preference of mine. You can choose whatever you want, okay? So in fluid mechanics, generally, the n is just 2 or 3, I said to you, right? Which means the max is 3D. And usually we only the max order of tensor we are concerned with is the second order tensor. Second order. Okay.